For this last lecture on the 1973 Arts Festival lecture series, we're very happy to have with us Miss Mildred Schmertz, who is a member of the American Institute of Architects. She is currently one of the senior editors of Architectural Record magazine. She earned a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh. She worked for an architect there. She then decided to go back to school, and she got an MFA degree at Yale University in photography and graphics. Excuse me. When she left Yale, she went to work for Architectural Record magazine, and she was in the graphic and layout portion of the magazine. She went from that part of the business into the editorial part of the magazine, and she's been there ever since. She is a member of the New York chapter of the AIA, the Architectural League, and the American Institute of Graphic Arts. She has edited and contributed chapters to 2 books, Open Space for People and Campus Planning and Design. She will speak on the architecture of Russia. She returned several months ago from a trip with 3 other American architects representing the architects of this country and the architects of the American Institute of Architects to the Russian professionals, and we had had a visit several months before that from a group of 4 Russian architects. So it's a very exciting story she has to tell about a very cram-packed trip with very little time to gather her thoughts until she got back. But I think she can tell you that story best herself. Ms. Schmertz.
This on. I should begin by saying that I, until now, have led a very easy life. If you're an architectural journalist, you go to a lot of very nice meetings, nice dinners, as we had tonight. Then when dinner's over, the journalist just leads back and listens to the speaker. And I've always wanted the speaker to be amusing and brief, but I'm afraid that at least I won't be as brief and amusing as I like the speaker to be. As Charles said, the trip that I took was interesting, and I think the first thing that makes it interesting is that it was sponsored by the highest level of the Soviet government. About 2 years ago, Brezhnev's nephew thought it would be a good idea if the Union of Soviet Architects sent 4 architects to the United States. So the Union of Soviet Architects wrote a letter to Max Urban, who's the president of the AIA, and said, can we send 4 architects, and will you send 4 back? So Max said okay, and 4 Russians, or rather 4 Soviet citizens came to the United States. One was Madame Shishkina, who was the vice president of the Union of Soviet Architects and executive director, and plays a role similar to Bill Slayton's. And another was a Estonian architect named Dmitry Bruin, who is director of planning in Estonia, and they sent an architect from the Ukraine, or actually 2 from the Ukraine, and they visited 6 major U.S. cities for about 3 weeks, and they were utterly exhausted by their U.S. hosts, and chickened out and invented business in Moscow and flew back. So they skipped the last leg of their trip. I'd like to report, and they didn't make their final address to the AIA. I'd like to say that we survived. We made every appointment. None of us collapsed. We made our final report and all returned. It was very taxing because each city, the architects of each city wanted us to see the best of everything, and there were wonderful Russian lunches and dinners and long hours spent in the offices of bureaucrats, and much too much time spent looking at housing, and a constant pace. But it was quite interesting. I think that these exchanges marked the end of an incredible isolation in the Soviet Union. We observed that the Soviets, that we visited, most of them had never been out of Iron Curtain countries. They weren't familiar with European or U.S. Books or magazines. There had been no interchange with schools in Europe or the United States, and there seemed to be they had an enormous interest in us because most of them hadn't had any contact with non-Soviets before. The trip was also interesting because we visited 5 republics, and some of us learned for the first time that there's a wide difference in the various republics. We were in what is considered old Russia, and then we went to Estonia, and then we went down to the Ukraine, and then to Georgia, and finally to Uzbekistan. And of course, different languages are spoken in each of these republics, and the ethnic character of the populace is different. And of course, in Estonia and Georgia and in Uzbekistan, we had a very strong sense that the architects weren't as happy to be part of the Soviet regime as they might have to appear to be. But anyway, this was the way the trip was organized, and it took only 3 weeks, and we covered 5,530 air miles, and we saw an awful lot. We saw it very, very fast. Now, I'd like to tell you a little of the kind of things that we saw. We visited the leading architectural school in Moscow. We visited Soviet architectural clubs in every city. We visited city and regional planning boards, housing bureaus. We went through housing developments. We saw collective fishery. We saw a lot of conservation and restoration, which the Soviets are very good at. They were very hospitable to us, and in the evenings we went to the ballet and the theater, and we had all kinds of Russian food, and we had a pretty good time. We were challenged. We continually had the problem of being tactful, because we didn't like much of the contemporary building that we saw, and yet the Soviets were showing us these works with a great deal of pride, and we could only, at least I could only gather that the pride was related partly to the fact that it was so difficult to accomplish anything in the Soviet system, so they had pride in actually accomplishing a building. Then also, I think their pride was related to the fact that never getting out of the country, they really didn't have anything to measure their performance against. So we were always trying to let them know that we had reservations, but without seeming rude and ungrateful. Well, to summarize what we didn't like about what we saw, if you take the housing, we felt that the architects we met weren't sufficiently involved in solving housing problems in the Soviet Union. That though we did meet a number of them who were involved in housing research bureaus, we didn't get the sense that their research was being implemented. We hear from time to time that the Russians are building a tremendous amount of housing, and that they might have some technological secrets that visitors from the West could benefit from. If this is the case, we didn't see any examples of it. The housing, the site planning was very bad. The systems, the prefabricated systems were really were quite crude. There seemed to be a lack of real study of detailing, and most of the construction looked really as though it just happened, almost as though it were inexorable. And they seemed to persist in using methods that had proved, that had defects. For instance, all over the Soviet Union, they use a precast concrete panel that has little pieces of tile embedded in it, and the tile appears to fall off. Part of it falls off when the panels are brought into the site, and more falls off when it's hoisted, and then once the panel's in place, a little heating and thawing, and more of these little ceramic tiles fall off. And so you would think that if an architect were in control, at some point he would say, let us not use these panels anymore. But they've been using them, looks like they've been using them for 12 or 15 years, and they're still using them. So you get a sense of a lack of architectural control, and a general look in the housing that was designed a long time ago. Then we had reservations about the civic buildings, the public buildings that we saw. First place, there aren't too many of them. In a city, say the size of Kiev, by the time they'd shown us their major new civic buildings and government buildings, well, at least I concluded that if you took the work of the three architects that I was traveling with, in their careers, they built more buildings, public buildings, more civic buildings, than the Russians were able to show us in a given city. So the volume of civic architecture is quite small, and the Soviets tend to reuse and adapt older buildings from the from other times. There were occasionally there were a few buildings that were very well done, but one was a hotel in Tallinn, which had been built by Finnish contractors, and the other was a cultural palace in Kiev, where evidently the government decided that they were going to build the best building they possibly could. So one got the sense that the architect didn't have much power, or let's say he couldn't function in the Soviet Union in the ways that we're accustomed to seeing an architect function. For instance, he seemed to have no control over the choice of materials. One of the reasons for this is that there's a tremendous shortage of materials of all kinds. He didn't seem to have any control over the choice of systems for the same reason. And he didn't seem to have much control over siting, and of course there aren't any architectural form givers or artists in the sense that we still think of architects in this country. I mean, there's just no question of any architect acting as an individual being entrusted with the shaping of space or the creation of an architectural work of art. That just doesn't seem to be part of the way they do things. Now, we saw an awful lot of housing, and this is because though the government gives it. No, another thing I wanted to say was that it seems that construction on the whole, construction of housing and public buildings has a low priority in the Soviet Union relative to the importance of building their industrial base and relative to their defense base. So the architects are working with really a relatively very small part of the budget, and I think I don't think that there's a great deal of government interest. However, the government is getting more and more behind housing construction. And, this is for three reasons. Of course, the first is that a tremendous amount of housing was destroyed, as you all know, in World War II. And the second reason is the one that is familiar to us all over the world, and that is that the increase in technology on the farms has made the farm worker obsolete, so he's moving to the city. So there's great movement to the city. And then, of course, the third reason for the great housing shortage is the one that the Soviets don't mention, and that is that they've neglected the problem for so long that it's extreme. And Soviets still live 2 or 3 families to one very small apartment and share a bathroom and kitchen. But I have some figures here. The government is now trying to house each family in their own individual housing unit in a 9, 12, or 16-story building. And the norm they're trying to reach is 160 square feet per person. Most Soviet citizens don't have 160 square feet per person. They're going to try and raise it to 205 square feet in a few years. Scientists and doctors and actors and architects are considered creative people, and they're given some more space in which to think. So that's true. So they theoretically can get more than 160 square feet per person. Now, our interpreter is an architect who had a family of 4, a wife and 2 children. And as an architect, he's entitled to 720 square feet, right now he's living in an apartment with 300 square feet, which gives 75 square feet per person, which is one half the current norm. And he doesn't see any hope of moving into a larger apartment for some time. I think I've said this, and I tend to reiterate it, but every time we ask the Soviet architects why Soviet construction was so shoddy, they said it was because of the tremendous pressure to meet the new quotas. Well, then and of course one other point which really encompasses all these things is that one had a sense of really the death of art in the Soviet Union. We couldn't speak for poetry or painting, but there was certainly a deadness in all the new building, which you really you have to see to believe. And I think that it's true that we can see with our own eyes that the totalitarian system has resulted in the death of art, or at least as far as we could see. But curiously enough, the Soviets venerate their past. They are very much interested in conserving and restoring the architecture of the Tsarist period and before. And they accomplish this with a skill which is downright amazing. And they invest a large proportion, a relative proportion of their money in it. For instance, in Leningrad, the Russians spend 150 million rubles per year restoring the art and architecture of their past. And I think there's a figure, that's one half of what they spend per year for housing in the Leningrad.
By train, it is now a half-hour run down there. This was formerly a large marsh. On the right, you see it as it appears today from the nearby town, which is known as Abbey Woods, because there was an abbey and there was a woods, and so Abbey Woods. In the distance, you see some of the high-rise buildings. Now, these high-rise buildings will constitute only a portion of this new town. The new town will ultimately house 60,000 people, and of course will include community centers and industry. In other words, a self-sufficient new town, but near London. And I'm sorry. This is a portion which has been built, which is less than a quarter of it. The highways that are indicated there have not yet been finished. They're merely streets. The street you see here, for instance, is at the very bottom of the map. That predominantly black spot is the medical center that opens onto a plaza, shopping plaza, and below that and above around it are the houses that have been constructed. as you approach it today from the little town, which of course was not the ultimate approach, but as you approach that part which has been built, you come up from just below at the bottom of the slide on the right, and you go up this ramp and onto the second level. Now, the principle on which this is built, the concept, is that of utilizing the entire ground area for vehicular circulation and elevating the pedestrian circulation to a second level, therefore by eliminating the traffic crossing. Well, this has advantages and very severe disadvantages. For those of you who are not familiar at all with this, I'll try to explain the section that you see above, which can certainly be focused better. Can you focus the other one? That's better. As you see in this section, the car storage, the circulation is on the ground level, and then you see a pedestrian access to what they call in England maisonettes, in other words, apartments that are on 2 levels, and that constitutes this portion right here. There are just 1 bay wide. You can determine the bay width by the little terraces, and then another 2-story masonette above that with a balcony access, as you see up here in this section. Now, in some respects, this is quite an admirable group of buildings and approach to buildings, in that it gets away from the monotony and mediocrity of the high-rise slab or the long continuous corridor by introducing the variation of materials and an irregularity along this pedestrian walk. One gets achieves some interesting architectural effects and alleviates that very tedious long, straight, narrow path approach. As you can see here in other levels, these are still on the pedestrian on the upper level section. Of course, those people who wish to have live in high-rise apartments have them. I'm discussing this now not from a technical point of view. There have been great difficulties with the technical system that was used here, but I'm just discussing it mainly as a critique of the entire concept. And here you see the ground level. In some places there are small gardens, as you see in the slide on the right, but for the most part the ground level is simply dedicated to cars, concrete, and very sparse areas of grass. Now, in the total picture, of course, there are large playing fields, there are artificial lakes, and much greening and outdoor space. But this is not true of the immediate compact neighborhood. And this is the slide on the right indicates how much under lower level practically unusable space exists and is paved Unfortunately, in England, they don't have the crime problem that we have in the United States, or this would be totally uninhabitable. Of course, they do have, few people have some ground level access to gardens. But this is generally the disposition of the garages and the kind of green that exists, which of course is not at all inviting to small children. As a matter of fact, it's defiant of small children because it's raised and practically marked keep off the grass. Then this again is the extent of planting. Over on the toward the shopping center, you have a large plaza with some openings that give light into the lower service area, which extends underneath all of this, and then some small portions, as you can see, are used for planting. But the entire area is so overwhelmingly a hard surface material that it becomes really forbidding when you think of it as being used by small children. There are simply no adequate places for the small children to be, and we realize too that it's the small child, the preschool child, and the mother who occupy a dwelling more than any other members of the family. When mothers have to wheel their tiny babies, the small child really has nothing that is tactily attractive in his early years, and if you believe as I do, that is a very serious handicap in the growth of the child, who cannot get out and put his feet on ground and grass and play in some dirt and mud and really feel natural materials. Well, those examples of the houses along the lake, of course, are delightful for adults and older children. But this is what is provided for the tiny ones. And occasionally you'll see two forlorn little things, such as these children in a carriage, really no place to go and rather bewilderedly wandering along. And then if the mother gets the child bundled up and the dish is done and goes down a ramp and gets down to a little children's play yard, this is what appears. Another hard surfaced area for little ones. So in that respect, I think the architects really sacrificed a great deal to this overall concept of segregation of traffic, to that of real human understanding. And in this case, it seems as though the car and the storage of the car has taken precedence over the people, and certainly over the small people. Now, another example of this is the nursery school of Le Corbusier. This applies to those at both to those at Nantes and Figny, and to Marseille, which you see here. His last publication was actually on a little book called The Nursery School, in which he attempts to justify the nursery school as he has conceived it, ought to be placed on the roof, and how marvelous this is because the child is up there in fresh air and has a view of the mountains and all of this exciting and elevating view in the distance. If you really knew, been very close to children, you know that they are not particularly interested in distant views. They're quite interested in pieces of grass and dirt and rocks and weeds and junk and whatever else is right under their feet and noses and eyes, things they can touch and feel, touch, smell, or attempt to eat. But their environment is extremely immediate and not one, they're not particularly given to long-distance focuses. In addition to that, here is an abundance, again, of hard surface materials, which certainly are not very satisfying. They're not satisfying surfaces to feel again, and actually they're very bad for children to play on because they can get some pretty nasty and enduring scratches from the abrasiveness of concrete. And in addition to that, this concrete in the summertime absorbs the heat of this Mediterranean city, and that is not inhabitable. And I've been up there several times in other parts of the year when the winds, Mistral, comes in, and it's again, because of the terrific winds on the top of the building, it's not usable. And I just happened to get these slides out, and there was a slide of a lady demonstrating the windiness of the situation. So all I'm implying is that men often fall far short of devising and designing for the people that they think they're sincerely considering. And in this case, I found this was totally inadequate. And Corbusier wrote extensively, having taken as his model for the habitation, at least in part, the Carthusian monastery of Ema in Tuscany. Well, that in itself is a magnificent building, or series of buildings, an ideal place for the contemplative adult to retreat to his cellular monastic living, and yet to have certain common rooms and share with others. But somehow or other, the monastery seems to be a rather inadequate prototype for families, and particularly for the small developing child. That's another portion of the Marseille roof on the right. This is a housing estate in London, in a very densely populated central part of London, not far from Victoria Station. And here, the concept of the superblock has been employed. This was actually built on the basis of a competition held for this particular estate, and won by a group of relatively young architects who did, I think, really a superior job, considering that this is a low-income council estate. And by utilizing the perimeter for the buildings, they have been able to get an interior space of green, and greens which somehow or other do reflect that wonderful quality of old London, which has its houses around greens. These are more accessible than the greens of London, because if you don't know, you should know that most of those greens have fences in them, and the people that live in the houses around them have the keys to the gates, and only their children may go into the little gardens. Of course, there are Hyde Park and Green Park and other public parks, but when you see these charming little squares, you think, oh, isn't that nice? But it's nice only for those people who are property owners on the perimeter of the green. Well, in this case, there's anybody can go in and use this, though presumably designed for the occupants of this low-income housing. The access to these apartments is by means of a balcony, as you see on the right, and direct access. These are also staggered apartments of different levels, so that you enter directly into your apartment from this balcony level and do not have to go down a long, dismal corridor. And on the again, this is another aspect of the exterior, and other views of the interior. There's a very limited amount of parking in a portion of the estate, but other than that, there is no traffic allowed in it, provided for. But it has, in addition to the concept, it is a very well executed building of very high quality in the use of materials and very, very careful detailing. As a matter of fact, I know of no luxury apartment in London that I should prefer living in to this one, other than the fact that, of course, the apartments are smaller than the more expensive apartments, but this is architecturally more elegant than the most extravagant ones. As you can see, the landscaping, which is quite young, it has been very nicely landscaped and very well detailed, as you see here. These children were rolling and playing on the lawn, and of course, by the time I got my camera out and focused, they immediately lined up like little pigeons on a pole to get in line for a traditional photograph. It's very difficult to get children, I find, in a spontaneous play, because the minute they catch your the glimpse of your camera, they insist upon lining up. It makes it look very artificial. And on the right is a very congenial corner that traps the sun and keeps out the wind, which is the area for the old people. Their rooms are around that, and on the ground level they have some club rooms and their own cafeteria where they may take their meals if they don't feel like preparing their own. Well, now this is a project in southern France, which really hasn't very much point in terms of anything, but since it's a rather unusual and I can only describe it as bizarre. And since I was there last summer and took the photographs, I thought perhaps you'd like to see this also. It's called La Grande Motte, and this is the Côte d'Azur and Marseille. Could you focus it just a little bit? Oh, that's better. Well, it's directly above my finger with a circle around it. This region, the Côte d'Azur, is, of course, has been inhabited as a great resort for many, many, many years. It's protected by mountains that come down to the sea and protect from winds that come very much from the west here. And this portion from Marseille over down to Pavilion, to the Spanish border, this is Languedoc-Roussillon. This area has not been developed for resorts, mainly because it was just a massive amount of marshland, and also because it really doesn't have the protection from those westerly winds. However, the French population, having grown as it has, or as all populations have, and the French being very avid to get to the seaside, at least many of them, and many of them want to get as close to the Mediterranean as fast as possible. This area is being a planning agency, so that what I'm about to show you makes sense ecologically and planning-wise, if not architecturally. It means that by grouping these various developments, the pollution can be controlled. That is, they can have centralized sewage plants, recycling plants, and so forth to keep certain areas green. By contrast to what I show you, in some of these areas that have been developed thus far, you'll just find houses along either side of the road, and one side has access to the beach, and the others have to cross the street, and there's a high building and a low building, and they just go on, side end to end for miles. That is, in those areas, as I say, which have been developed, much of this land was not developable until they began draining these marshlands. So, in the overall concept, it certainly has some validity. The planners have done as well as they could in terms of utilization or recommended utilization of the land. And there are many developments all along this coast. There are many areas that are just, high-rise apartment buildings that are jumping up out of the sand dunes, so to speak. And then there's one over Agada, which is a little bit to the west, which is an enormous, gigantic donut with apartments all around that open in and out, and in the center they have pools and recreation facilities. But I chose to stay over a bit and photograph this one, which, as I said, is called the Grand Mott, and that is the immediate plan of it. The access, of course, is from what will be a major motorway to the top of this map. This is as it appears from a distance, and the slide on the right I took simply because it was such an unusual thing to see a Rialto bridge sitting out here in the middle of nowhere, going from nowhere to nowhere. And these are La Grande Motte. It's to house about 40,000 people ultimately, and this will have no industry. This is strictly a resort town. These apartments are put up by individual contractors and owners. Though there was an architect who laid out the general plan, and he established the key to the development, and that is that all buildings must be in the shape of a pyramid. Now, how he arrived at the pyramid was better than some of the form for apartments, which really seems very strange, because it means if one side of the pyramid faces to the sea, if at least one other side can't, or if you put it at an angle and two face the sea, that means two other sides can't. So it's a very strange concept, but it has a certain Disneyland kind of quality anyway, as you can see. Anyway, they're rapidly building these, and they were occupied just last year for the first time. They're flats and apartments that are for sale, and of varying sizes, of course. That is some kind of community playhouse or something. Now, if this is not your idea of a quaint little cottage on the Mediterranean, I think I share with you that sentiment, but it's not my idea of what I should envision us having on the Mediterranean either. But evidently, enough people are willing to live under these conditions to. Someone said to me, the Soviets recently, he said, well, you know, I think the people that would live in a place like that are the would-be jet set people. Oh, as you notice, one of those was called Acapulco. Some of them are large enough to have central courts and skylights at the top, which illuminate these courts, and around these courts on the ground floor we'll have some shops. But this one on the left has no central court, but it has enormous corridors that, of course, diminish as they rise. Nevertheless, that's so much interior space that can possibly be utilized for part of the apartment. So they have big areas of hallways and apartments around the periphery. Other examples, and it was somewhere along in here at night. I went into one of those loud-sounding night places, and to my shock, it was all done up in the decor of a low, dark cave. So a cave inside this would-be 21st century structure, I thought was just about the end. The little community center of this administrative center, you see in these two slides, somebody's cribbed a little bit from Le Corbusier, as you can all see. The one exception to the pyramidal building is the hotel, which is a part of a large chain of French hotels, something like Holiday Inn, not quite as international. It's not international like the Hilton, but it's a Holiday Inn sort of thing in France. So the Frontel Hotel, for some reason, was able to build a strictly vertical building, and then as part of the center of this community center, one finds this rather austere, whatever it is. It may be, I thought it could either be used for Greek tragedy or for funerals. And on the right, you have some modern Neolithic landscape architecture. Well, that is the end of the survey of housing and such. Again, I should like to thank you for having had the pleasure to be here.
One of the things they're going to do is straighten that cross. They promised us. But we had the sense that the Soviets won't over-restore. They won't turn this into a Williamsburg. They'll just keep it from further decline. I was afraid you were going to ask that. Let's see if I've got. No, I don't know about these. I think they could be 16th century. beautiful house in the town of Suzdal, another convent. Of course, we were seeing this on a gray day. You can imagine what those domes are like in the sun. It's a marvelous blue, gold stars.
They're all in the same place?
All in the same place. This is all Suzdal. And let me say that it's only a tiny bit of Suzdal. And Suzdal is one of 7 cities that are, some of them are more wonderful. But these are the things that art and architecture lovers go to Russia to see. And up until now, they had to undergo a certain amount of hardship and expense to get to them. I went through those last pictures so slowly because they're the best looking things you're going to see. It's downhill all the way from Suzdal. But, well, that's not quite true. These are some old wooden houses that they're also going to preserve in the town. I took 2 pictures that, when they saw me photographing it, they decided they'd leave. The detail of the trim. Of course, there are old wooden houses like this everywhere in the Moscow region, but they're only being preserved in special places like Suzdal. More houses. Still Suzdal. Now the day is over, and this is the next day in Moscow, and this was they gave us a sightseeing tour in the morning, and what you're looking at is, as you doubtless know, are the walls of the Kremlin, and you can see beyond the walls over there on the left, the towers of one of the cathedrals of the Kremlin. This is some of our group. On the left is Scott Farabee, who was then president-elect of the AIA, and as you know is now president. And next to him is our guide for the day in Moscow. And next to him is Elgin Grigoriev, who was our Russian translator, who was with us for the full 3 weeks. And next to him is John McGinney from Houston, Texas, and Frank Hope from San Diego. And this is a monastery that we saw that morning in Moscow. We asked them to stop the car and got out and took that. The next pictures, of course, as you know, are taken in Red Square. That's the Church of St. Basil, and the walls of the Kremlin are to the right. You can just barely see Lenin's tomb on the right. The other way. That's Lenin's tomb, and of course, crowding the walls is an 18th century palace within the Kremlin. St. Basil again. Some the towers. The Kremlin, of course, is at the heart of Moscow. It's the old city. I beg your pardon? I think it's quite old. I think it's, isn't it 12th century or earlier? And these were taken these are the cathedrals of the Kremlin, and they have marvelous mosaics. They're fabulous inside. And of course, you can see how lovingly they're maintained. And there's extensive restoration work inside that they're doing right now. This is another cathedral. There are about 4 or 5 major churches within the Kremlin. Another look at Red Square. Now, anyway, we spent the rest of the time in Moscow in various offices, bureaus. Then we went to Leningrad, and we went out to Pushkin, which used to be Tarskoye Selo. And you see on your right the Catherine Palace, which has been extensively restored because it was affected by shelling in World War II. It has marvelous gardens, which you'll see. And this is the Cameron Pavilion, which Catherine had built just shortly after she finished the palace. She, I guess, gotten word that there was a classic revival in England, and she got the word that an architect named Cameron did it as well as anybody. So she imported Cameron and his family and put them up in the Baroque palace and ordered him to give her a pavilion in the new style. So this is known as the Cameron Pavilion, and it's one of the great sites at Pushkin. It's really extremely elegant, as you can see. And it followed. She was a little late with her Baroque, and she was on time with this classic revival. This is one of the long avenues. This is we're now in the gardens at Pushkin, and here, of course, she was influenced by the French landscape architects. Curiously, you can see in Russia, you can see the influence of England and France and the Low Countries, all of, the cultures that they imported, but there's still a distinctive Russian character to everything. Another pavilion by Cameron. These sculptures were buried during the shelling, buried for their protection, as was much of the art in the palaces of Pushkin. Now, this picture and some others that are coming should give you some idea of how skillful the Russians are at restoring. Now, I don't know about this room, but I was in other rooms at Pushkin where the destruction had been almost complete, there would be a picture in the corner of a completely gutted room, which was almost rubble, with the roof off and the sky coming in and big holes in the floor and virtually nothing left. But you would be standing in a room as elegant as this, which means that the Russians have workmen that can lay a parquet floor like that, who can restore ornament, like the gilded ornaments that you see. I imagine the stove was authentic and was saved. This is a parquet. This is a detail of the floor. Here again, the amount of work that you see is largely contemporary. How they find people that could work in plaster like that, I don't know. This palace at Pushkin has been virtually rebuilt. It was designed by Cameron for the grandson of Catherine's. Yes, the next pictures. This is, of course, it's still the Catherine Palace, and these pictures are from the Novosti press agency. Some interiors. They have to find people that can weave those tapestries. I was told, and I don't know whether this is true, but I was told that just after the revolution, Lenin decided that the cultural heritage should be preserved, and he established a school and invited all the best of the craftsmen of the day to teach and pass on the old techniques. The next pictures are in the garden at Pushkin. Very English or very Italian. That's another view of the Cameron Pavilion. Now these pictures are just general views of Leningrad. They're taken along the Nevsky Prospect, and I don't think they're especially good as photographs. I'll go through them quickly, but they do give you a sense of the 18th century city, which, as I said, is being preserved. Well, that doesn't, but it's really quite lovely with its canals. It's a little like Paris. later. That's a copy of St. Basil's. That's a very elegant gate in the older section. Admiral's Gate. Oh, I was making them go fast because I thought that, you know, they were a little motley. But do you want me to go back or over them, or? There's somebody on a motorcycle. All right, now the next pictures, we're out of Leningrad now, and the next pictures show restoration in Tallinn and Kiev and Tbilisi and Tashkent and Samarkand. The man on the right there is Dmitry Brun, who's the chief planner in Tallinn, and he was one of the four architects that the Soviets sent to the United States. The woman in the middle was our Estonian translator, and the man on the left is in charge of restoration in Tallinn. It's the group again. I have to go through that. Tallinn is a medieval city, and I have just a few pictures of their churches and the city wall. Restoration is extremely active there. This is taken from a high point looking out over the roofs. Many. But you're seeing part of the medieval wall there, as you can see. You can see some of the work that's going on. Tallinn has a great many visitors since it's on the Baltic and near Finland. A great many people come there, which is, I think, one of the reasons they're restoring it so actively. Now, the next pictures are taken in Georgia, near Tbilisi, and there they have some marvelous old stone churches, 17th century stone churches. And the first day we went to Tbilisi, the Georgian architects took us on an all-day trip to the mountains, and we visited some of these churches. You can see one up on top of that mountain. Okay, there's another. These are marvelously sited in the hills. And this is an old section in the town of Tbilisi, which is being restored. And the next pictures are interesting. They're taken in an outdoor museum in just outside the town of Tbilisi, and it's a museum of old buildings which they've taken down and constructed piece by piece. The museum isn't finished yet, and they'll be working on it for quite some time, but this is a typical old wooden house. And these last pictures of restoration were taken in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. See there, the workmen are very painstakingly replacing the tiles. The Muslim tradition is still quite strong in Uzbekistan. We learned that the Uzbeks are very much opposed to Soviet change. They persist in leading their own lives. They're also rather prosperous because there's a very rich agriculture in Uzbekistan, so they've got lots of food and fruit. The transportation system is so poor in the Soviet Union that the Soviets can't get all the rich farm produce of Uzbekistan up to Moscow and Leningrad and the other cities. This is, of course, the same kind of ornament that you see in Istanbul and many Muslim countries. Here's an Uzbek. Sweeping in front of a temple. I should say that another remarkable thing about the restoration in the Soviet Union is the enormous range of scholarship that it requires, because there's so many periods and so many styles and so many cultural influences, but they seem to be doing it all quite well. This is market, as you can see. We saw more food there than anywhere. Those pieces of bread celebrate the 2000th year of the existence of Samarkand. It was 2,000 years old in 1970, and that bread commemorates it. Those are all Soviet citizens. All right, now the slideshow is almost over. but the next group of pictures are a mixture of pictures that I took and also slides that were given me. That building is the TV center of the city of Moscow, and the Moscow architects are enormously proud of it. We spent almost a whole day there. I'm not kidding. We walked they made us kiss every stone. They showed us every room inside, and we met everybody involved, and they think it's great. I don't know. They could be. I just don't know. They could be glass that fell out and got replaced with something else. This is a very important building in terms of what it does, since it's the center of their whole TV broadcasting system. And this is the base of the tower that their TV broadcasting tower. I couldn't get a picture of it, of the whole height of it, because they wouldn't let me get far enough away from it. They're very protective of this area, but they're very proud of this tower also. This is some housing that we saw, and it's better than much of what we saw. The thing is that in Soviet housing, the doors nothing is plumb. The windows sag, the doors are crooked, and they don't fit the frame, and plaster cracks. And the weatherproofing and caulking is just thrown on, and even the newest high-rise apartment towers that they showed us had begun to fall apart, or they were never put together right. The halls aren't painted. The switchgear shows. You'd have to see it. I can't tell. I think it is, or else their balconies, their porches. This is the Palace of Culture in Kiev, and though it may look like a rather par for the course building if it been done in the United States, for the Soviet Union, it's